Hello everyone, my name is Peter Coughlin. I'm the director of the Business Economics course, and I have developed and am now presenting and recording this short presentation to provide an introduction and overview of what we'll be covering in these 10 lessons of the Business Economics course. Now, of course, many of you are coming off, in fact, all of you as students are coming off just finishing up an economics course, right? And you may be looking at your Eisenhower School curriculum and say, wait a minute, right? I thought we just finished economics. What is this other additional economics we're going to be getting here at the end of the fall semester, right? And of course, a natural question. So you probably want to know what is similar, what is different. Well, the similarities, obviously, they're both economics. But the reality is the econ course you've taken so far, the fall econ course, is primarily focused on the issue of macroeconomics. Whereas the business economics course, we're going to begin to introduce you to the lens and the focus of microeconomics. Of course, if you're not an economist, you say, that's all Greek to me. What does that actually mean? Well, let me tell you. Macroeconomics is really primarily studying the sort of economy-wide phenomena, right? Inflation, unemployment, economic growth. These sorts of things that you measure on a national level and sometimes international level, right? But broad, economy-wide phenomena. Whereas micro, not surprisingly, focuses more narrowly than macro. Micro is instead the study of primarily individual markets, individual transactions, interactions, right? How producers and consumers make decisions, how they interact in markets. So it's got a much more narrow focus. We focus on at least this course, we're going to focus on business decisions, consumer decisions, then in markets, and then in industries, right? So the idea is we're going to focus on the components of the overall economy that you've been studying so far in your macroeconomics course, your econ course in the fall, which is focused on macroeconomic issues. Now, these courses, these two branches are closely intertwined, right? Anybody who gets a PhD in economics has to study both macro and microeconomics, right? But people tend to go on to specialize in one or the other, right? But they of course derive from the same principles, but they still are distinct, and they do address different questions, right? Which is why you'll see us addressing different questions, than you addressed in your fall econ course. In fact, even though we have these two courses in the Eisenhower School curriculum with the word economics in the title, the actual closer companion course to business economics is actually industry analysis, right, which will come in the spring. It is the companion course due to content, right? Industry, even though each course is self-contained, industry analysis picks up on many of the principles we're going to cover in business economics. It is a companion course due to the fact that I am the course director for both, at least this year, hopefully not forever, but for this year, I'm the course director of both, and I have, even though I've built upon foundations that have long been established at Eisenhower School, I've designed these courses with help of many others to sort of, be companion courses, and also due to faculty. Most of the faculty who teach business economics are also going to teach industry analysis, right? Because we will be aligned in industry study seminars in the spring, you won't necessarily have the same professor, but the odds are your instructor who will teach you industry analysis in the spring also taught business economics in the fall. Now, in designing these, as I mentioned, I did not design these. These are built on, there's a basis on which these courses were designed in previous years, or there's a basis of history here at Eisenhower School on which I drew richly in talking to colleagues. But there was still an opportunity to step back and say, okay, wait a minute, what is the purpose of these courses, these two companion courses? What is the hole they are designed to fill in the Eisenhower School mission? And if you read the mission statement of the Eisenhower School, right, I think about it, again, the mission statement itself says, quote, to prepare selected military officers and civilians for strategic leadership and success in developing national security strategy and evaluating, marshaling, and managing resources in execution of that strategy. Right? It's basically about aligning strategy and resources. Being a visual thinker and, of course, an economist, I thought about things from a supply and demand perspective. Right? On one end, you have the national security strategy, which dictates your resource demand. What resources do you need to fulfill your national security strategy? Right? And the supply of those resources is coming from the national security industrial base, or now we talk also about the national security innovation base, right? Sort of two distinct but interlinked elements of the resource supply. And so the idea is then, how do you, in the issue about aligning those to make sure that the resource supply meets the needs of the national security strategy or the resource demand, is about evaluating, marshaling, and managing resources, right? And that's what we do at this school. Now, much of the Eisenhower School curriculum, right, is really, even though it looks more broadly, it really is looking at things from the lens of the demand side of this interaction, right? is talking about defining and determining national security strategy, and then from that, what resources are needed, right? And so, or in general, taking these issues from the perspective of government or defense or national security. And so, therefore, business and economics and industry analysis won't exclusively be on the opposite side, but it is primarily focused on understanding this challenge from the lens of industry, understanding the resource supply side of things. How do firms and participants in the national security industrial base or national security innovation base look at and respond to the challenge of matching resource demands and resource supplies in a national security setting? And we truly try to get into the heads in both of these, whether understanding why we need certain resources to meet our national security needs, why does industry provide certain resources and not others, and why do they provide them at certain quantities, qualities, and costs, right? And why not differently? So we certainly try to get into the heads of the players and understand the why question. But we also ultimately, part of our mission has to be the so what. What do we do about it, right? If everything works smoothly, that's great. But what if it doesn't, right? What if there is a disconnect between the resource demand and resource supply? And that's where the evaluating, marshaling, and managing resources comes in. And the policy, being a policy school, ultimately, the policies that we come up with to do that are really about national security, innovation, and industrial policy, right? What is our national security, innovation, industrial policy to make sure that we have the resource supply we need to meet to satisfy the resource demand of our national security strategy? So that's, again, where BE and I fit in terms of the overall school mission. Now, in doing that, then I sort of mapped out a progression, not a set, but an actual progression, building on steps, a step-by-step progression of concepts that ultimately are designed to end up with that so what question. What do we do? What is the national security industrial policy? What's the right national security industrial policy, given all the steps that came before that? And it sort of breaks into, you can break it into three sort of ideas, three topics, or three areas here. Really, the first set of concepts are all about industry economics, understanding fundamental, supply and demand of markets, how firms interact, how that dictates the underlying economic structure of industries, right? Then understanding the environment, i.e. the industry, how the firms behave, that's the business analysis. How do we measure performance? That's financial analysis, but also there's decision-making involved there. How do the firms choose their strategic positioning? How do they innovate? How do they choose their corporate strategy, their global positioning? These sorts of things are business analysis. And then the last part is about the idea of, okay, what do we do about it? Right? What do we do from a policy perspective to make sure that, given the industry economics and the business choices, that it's meeting national security needs? And so what we've done is we have 10 sessions in the fall in the business economics course and 25 sessions in the spring in the industry analysis course. So I broke things down, along those lines, right? So we're going to cover primarily in the business economics course, we're going to primarily cover the topic of industry economics, right? We're going to understand what drives, what business choices are driving the economic structure of industries, right? There's a lot more economics that we'll get to in the spring, but we're focusing narrowly on this idea of understanding the fundamental drivers of industry economics in the fall with the business economics course. Now, with that in mind, it's important to talk about these design principles. So once I know what we're going to cover, right, conceptually, what are the design principles that came into the design of this course? And you should, again, these are, what I'm about to describe is all in your syllabus. You should read your syllabus. Those words have meaning, particularly this is a section about core course design principles. Understand, I'll talk about them briefly here, but you should make sure you read the syllabus about these. So the first one is this idea on the emphasis on analytical and strategic thinking. And that maybe seem like a throwaway line, right? But it's really not. And so to back up a bit, when these courses have often been referred to collectively as sort of the mini MBA, if you will. I don't think that's the best label for them, but it's taking that label, it's the mini MBA, or it's also been described as a previous comment that this is where you learn, the Eisenhower School students learn to think the way business people think, or learn how business people think. Not necessarily to make you into business thinkers, but learn how the business side of this national security challenge is thinking. Well, okay, what type of thinking really matters? Well, to motivate that, there was a survey about what are the most valued benefits of business education in general, right? So anybody who's been educated in business, what do people who hire them actually care about? And so there's a survey done among hundreds of people who recruit business graduates and ask them, of all these, I think there's a list of about 40 different abilities or skills that business graduates might ostensibly possess, and ask them, which of these do you actually find attractive? And surprisingly, there were only 7 characteristics that recruiters actually found attractive, a majority of them found attractive among business graduates, and these are them. These are the 7 characteristics. And you'll see, if you look at the percentages on the right, some of them, only a slight majority, actually find particularly attractive. And in fact, the 2 that are the clearly most important skills that anybody who does any business education is supposed to get is the ability to think analytically and the ability to think strategically, right? And so these are, in order for you to get some benefit out of a mini MBA and for you to get some benefit of understanding the supply side of the market, understanding how business people think, right? You've got to understand the ability, have the ability and develop the ability to think analytically and the ability to think strategically, right? And so we'll talk about that. And by the way, it's important, we'll talk about that in this course. What does that actually mean? There's actually a specific meaning about an analytical thinking, which, for example, means literally breaking things into individual parts, right? It means seeing the trees for the forest, not seeing the forest for the trees. It's the opposite of synthesis, right? And the ability to think strategically, well, that is the entire second half of the business economics course, is all about the economics of strategy. All right. So if that's the first design principle, again, listed in your syllabus, please read about what my thoughts on that. But also, understand the priority of this course is going to be the art and science of economic thinking. Right? I've said in this, others might disagree with this approach, but my view is, look, I want to teach you to understand the analytical strategic thinking, and the rest of the course is practice. Right? It's all about practice doing that thinking. Right? And so I don't have as much emphasis, although you will, of course, as a student, be taught these things and expect to understand them. But the specific economic models or conclusions are not what I'm hoping you learn, you retain 5 years from now. But that is the practice that you will get in analytical strategic thinking, is applying it to specific economic models. Also, this idea of robust conceptual foundations. Again, these words might seem nebulous, but I have a specific thing. In particular, I want to emphasize concepts, not topics. Well, what does that mean? A topic is we can sit and talk about. We could talk about the. I'm a basketball coach. We could watch a basketball game and talk about what happened in that basketball game. That is a topic. We've talked about it. But a concept would be, wait a minute, you see what they did with that defense. I think when they played defense this way, a concept is something you talk about it with the goal of learning something that you can then apply. Right? We're not doing knowledge for knowledge's sake. We're doing knowledge for action. We want each class to walk away with a certain set of concepts, or even one concept, right, that you then could conceivably apply in your future analysis, future career, at Eisenhower School and beyond. There's also the idea of a logical progression towards a well-defined goal. It's not a collection of concepts, not a collection of topics. It's not like just a bunch of here's a list of things we're going to cover that are somehow related to business economics. But in fact, they build upon each other. Lesson 2 builds upon lesson 1. Lesson 3 builds upon lesson 2, etc. We're all, and the business economics is all progressing towards the goal of a holistic understanding of industry economics. We're going to conclude with tools like the 5 forces framework, as well as the value net framework, tools that help you understand holistically what's going on inside an industry. There's an emphasis on active learning, right? So you will see that half of our classes, if not more, involve some sort of case study. Right? Even when we have a lecture, right, it's really going to be a discussion-oriented lecture. We really want to get students involved. We want to make sure that there's active learning and in-class simulations, right? Different faculty will choose different simulations, but there might be a production simulation, a market simulation. But again, the idea is to emphasize on active learning. And lastly, the complementary roles of readings and seminar lessons. What I mean by that is primarily is that I personally do not think that when we all get together, all dressed nicely, sitting in that seminar room in Eisenhower School, that we should, just regurgitate what's already written in the textbook or in the readings, right? I don't believe that we should lecture to students and repeat what was in the readings. In other words, the seminar session should not be a substitute for the readings. Instead, the seminar lessons should be complementary. Right? They should sort of emphasize the most important points of the readings. They should give an experiential reinforcement of the concepts that are in the readings, but they should not just repeat what's in the readings. But that also means, by the way, that you're still responsible for what's in the readings, right? And so therefore, because we're going to emphasize the most important points in the seminar rooms, right, they may not cover everything that's in the readings, but you're still responsible for at least what's listed as an essential concept reading in your syllabus. All right. So again, all 5 of these bullet points are listed in your syllabus with more depth of discussion. I encourage you to look at that. Okay, so with that sort of background in mind, now let me talk about lesson by lesson what we're actually going to cover. And these are just going to be teasers here, right? So again, even within the 10 lessons of business economics, there is a concept progression. Again, the idea being it's a building block approach. Each lesson builds upon the other. And I've approximately broken those down into the economics of markets, understanding market behavior, right, and the economics of strategy. And as we go through, you'll understand what the distinction is, when you need to begin to think about, when businesses in particular need to begin to think strategically and what that means for market structure. Now, starting off, the very first lesson, so the first 3 lessons, if you will see, you can look at the first 3 lessons we do sort of demand, supply, and then supply and demand together. That's really the first 3 lessons of this course. So the first lesson we're going to talk about in the very first lesson is going to be about economic thinking, right? So basic ideas of, trade-offs and incentives and opportunity costs, thinking at the margin, the idea of the logic of economic thinking and what that means for consumption decisions, choosing to buy or not buy. That's going to be the demand side of markets, right? Where the demand curve, if you will, comes from because of that. Lesson 2, we're going to look at the supply side, right? So understand economic costs. What costs matter for firm production decisions when they decide to produce or not produce, to enter or not enter, to exit or not exit, these sorts of things. How does that dictate the supply side of the market? So that's going to sort of tell you where the supply curve comes from in a market, right? Sort of what's driving the supply side of any market. And then lesson 3 is going to be about putting them together, putting supply and demand together. And we're going to talk about what I call the 3 E's of of supply and demand, which are equilibrium, efficiency, and elasticity. So we're going to get to all these ideas of what it means when we put the supply and demand together. Having those 3 foundational lessons in place, we're now at lesson 4 is about firms in competitive market. What is a competitive market? We'll talk about this, but it means roughly many identical sellers here, all selling hamburgers, many identical buyers, right? And anybody can sell to anybody. So that's the idea of a very competitive market. Lots of buyers, lots of sellers, similar, if not almost identical products. That's the idea of competitive markets. And we're going to teach this via the case studies. This will be our first case study, will be this case study on the offshore drilling industry. And we will talk more about what we mean by case study method, case study methodology, how it may be different from what you've experienced previously. But this is going to be our first case study talking about understanding firms' behavior in competitive markets. Now, and then we're going to talk about sort of this, economists have the notion of perfect competition, which we'll define in lesson 4, but then we're going to talk about departures from perfect competition. For example, what about when you still have this burger seller, but there's only one of them? One burger seller, many buyers. That's known as a monopoly, right? So that's one departure from perfect competition when you only have one seller. Another departure is where you still have many sellers, but they're not selling identical products. They're slightly different, right? Here we have a burger vendor, a hot dog vendor, a pizza vendor, a popcorn vendor. Again, this is sort of the idea of monopolistic competition. So these are more realistic examples of markets than the perfect competition example. And so that will conclude actually the first half of the course, which is about the economics of markets. The second half of the course is all about economics of strategy. And to do that, we first got to give you the principles of strategic thinking, which are in the field of game theory. And we'll talk about what that really means. It doesn't mean playing Monopoly or tic-tac-toe, right? But understanding the ideas of game theory. And we'll apply those to oligopoly competition. So oligopoly competition means when you only have a few players. Here, if you only have 2 people competing to sell to many different customers, that would be 2, meaning would be a duopoly, but we're going to give examples there again of an understanding. We're doing again another case study there of a duopoly competition, applying the ideas of game theory. We then have we're going to talk about monopsony. What is a monopsony, right? People don't hear about that much. It's barely mentioned in your econ textbook. But monopsony is important for us because a monopsony is when you have a single buyer. Right, when you only have one buyer and many sellers, right? And for many defense markets, there's only one buyer of, nuclear weapons, right? So the idea of, in defense markets, we often have to understand monopsony, but we have to understand, in particular, whether it be big economies of scales, design competition, the characteristics of defense markets that make those markets unique, right? We're going to again do that with a very interesting case study that's about selling missiles to the Navy. We then will talk about the drivers of market structure and power. So up until this point, we've talked about different market structures, whether competitive markets, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, monopsony, monopoly. But what drives that, right? And so this is going to be a lesson about factors, things like economies of scale, economies of scope, learning economies, things like network effects, right? These are these dynamics that tend to make that cause you, once you have a lead, to get a bigger lead, right? So if you will, positive return effects, first mover advantage, these sorts of ideas. Those are the type of dynamics that tend to dictate, a market structure, market power. And then the last 2 lessons are all about putting it all together. 9 and 10 are about industry analysis. Fundamentally, how do we after having done all of these individual pieces, now how do we holistically look at understanding industry economics? And that's going to be the first model, the most well-known model probably in all of the field of economics and strategy, is the idea of the five forces, Porter's five forces. We're going to talk about how we use the five forces to understand industry economics. And then we're going to do that, and then we're going to conclude. Lesson 10 is going to be a little different view. It's similar to the five forces. You're going to look at a company's both suppliers and customers, but it adds the nuance of complementers, something that's not explicitly included in the five forces. This is the notion of the value net, right? And we're also going to look, beyond even the value net, look at the role of government in understanding broader industry analysis. But again, with those last two lessons, they conclude with holistic models of looking at overall industry economics, right, that have been built up throughout the course of the business economics course. Now, of course, students, well, what do I really care about as a student? What is this going to be on the test? Well, the reality is we actually have two tests, right? Or not even tests. There should be very low pressure quizzes, right? There's no paper required. This is a 1 credit, 10 lesson course, right? 40% of your grade is class participation, so put a lot of emphasis there. There's going to be a basic knowledge check quiz done online outside of class on your own time, right? Multiple choice, true, false questions done online on Blackboard. Give you a few days to find any window of time, any place in the world that you want to take this quiz. Take the quiz, right? And we'll basically just make sure that you're following along in the concepts in lessons 1 through 5, and then there'll be another non-cumulative check at the end of the course. There will be another knowledge check quiz on lessons 6 through 10. Again, non-cumulative, right? But making sure that you're again keeping up with the basic concepts as well, so you can apply them effectively in the course discussion, in the class discussion, as well as leading into the industry analysis course, which comes, of course, in the spring. All right, well, that's the introduction. Your individual instructors will probably offer additional nuance and feedback and perspective and disagree with what I've said here. But if you're watching this hopefully gives you a good overview and introduction to what we're going to cover in these 10 lessons of the business economics course. Thank you.